Well, I think we can start. Welcome, everybody. And, well, first of all, we would like to thank Amira Bennison for being here with us today, for having accepted our invitation. And we also wanted to thank Casa Árabe, which has organized everything and all the means necessary for this session to take part, which is part of a cycle which has been organized within the cycle of University Aula Árabe 7, together with the University of Granada, who we would also like to thank for participating, and also all of the students who we think most of you're a majority here. We also invite you to visit Casa del Chapit, which is the basis for the Arab Studies School, and we would invite you to visit this house and the library, which we are sure will be very useful in your studies in general. Well, thank you also to the interpreters who will be here with us today, and the sound and technical team and the video team. I would like to give the floor to Javier right now. Well, thank you very much, Javier. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Well, as I said before, thank you very much, Elsa, and we would like to thank the School of Arab Studies for having welcomed us and having welcomed this activity. We think it is a very good occasion for all of you, for my students as well, to get to know this space. This is a very iconic space, not just because of its history, but because of all the works carried out here, the research work, also the library, which is fantastic, as Elsa said, and hopefully you'll be able to use it not only for our subject, but for the rest of your studies. Thank you to Casa Árabe as well. Thanks to Olivia, Marina, for having allowed us another year to be part of this Aula Árabe, which is a project with which or where we can place this talk. This is a project we've been cooperating with for many years. First of all, we started in Madrid, but this year, for the first time, it is in Granada, and that allows us the opportunity to bring some professors and researchers of the highest level. And this is a very good opportunity for everybody, especially for our students, to which this program is addressed. Thank you also to FIAP for having been in charge of the organization of the technical team, interpretation, recording, and it's it's a pleasure to count on this team that offers us this support. And also we wanted to thank the Studies of History at the University of Granada, which is been cooperating with Aula Árabe and Casa Árabe, which is the framework for this activity. It hasn't Alberto García Porras, the coordinator of these studies, has not arrived yet, but he will. And without his support, this activity wouldn't have been possible. And also thanks to Professor Amira Bennison for being here today and accompanying us. It's a total pleasure to have her here. Well, we've known each other for many years already. And she's one of these people that you never stop learning from. Every time you read something or you reread something that she's written, you learn something new. That's why it is a privilege to have her here. As you know, Amira is a history professor of Maghreb at the University of Cambridge, where she's also the director of the studies on Middle East, and well, she's one of the greatest authors on the history of the Maghreb, and I recommend you her book. I've done it already in our classroom, the book on Almoravids and Almohads. This is the synthesis book most updated that there is on these two empires, But she's also written about the Abbasi Caliphate, the Morocco, pre-colonial Morocco, and so a very long way that has brought her here today to talk to us about the history of Maghreb through its cities, which, if I'm not wrong, this is your latest editorial project. So it is. We are very, very lucky to have her here today. After this talk, we will open some time for questions and answers, and of course we can do that. You can do it in Spanish if you need so, or also in English. And as I told you in the classroom, I have threatened you enough. I hope that you will participate actively in it, because this is the main objective of this meeting, of this session. So without further delay, Amira, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Coming along to listen to me. I'm very sorry I'm not speaking in Spanish, but we've got the simultaneous translation, so I hope that everything I say will be clear. I'd like to, first of all, offer my own thanks to Javier and Elsa for the very kind invitation to speak to you today, and of course also to the Casa Árabe and the Fundación Internacional for their support for this lecture in many different ways. It's a genuine pleasure to be here in Granada and to be talking to you all. And I hope you enjoy my lecture, and I'm looking forward to your questions at the end. So the idea behind this lecture, the history of the medieval Muslim Maghreb through its cities, is something that has come together for me over the last few years. And I'm going to be sharing with you some of the ideas which I've put into my new book, The Medieval Maghreb, Cities, Patronage and Power, which explores ideas of urbanism within North Africa. And there were some main questions which I was thinking about. When I began my career, there was a lot of talk about the Islamic city and questioning that very notion of an Islamic city. We rarely speak about a Christian city or a Jewish city or a Hindu city. So why an Islamic city? And a lot of scholars argued against that kind of essentializing notion that you can have something that's called an Islamic city, and suggested alternatives. Perhaps we should talk about an Arab city, a Persian city, a Turkish city, for instance. I wasn't particularly satisfied with those solutions myself. And in thinking about North Africa, neither Arab nor Persian nor Turkish was particularly relevant. One could perhaps then start thinking in terms of a Berber city or an Amazigh city, to use the preferred term nowadays. But even that didn't quite fit in my view. So I decided to think about it in terms of something that our sources do talk about, and that's the view of a particular dynasty towards a city. So my questions were really about, can we think more in terms of a city shaped in a particular way by a particular dynasty, and then how does that dynasty interact with ideas of religion, space, and the city in the Islamic world more broadly. So I began to also think about relationships between cities founded in North Africa, the Maghreb, and Eastern prototypes, places like Mecca and Medina in Arabia, or Kufa and Basra in Iraq, or Damascus, or Baghdad later on. And it's worth remembering that, of course, in the pre-Islamic period, people also had what one might call an urban imaginary, but they tended to look to other imperial centres, Rome perhaps, or Constantinople, for their vision of what a city should look like. But in the Islamic era, those ideas, or the view, if you like, shifted towards cities in the Islamic world, some of the ones that I've mentioned. So I was interested in how that new sense of an urban imaginary rooted in the Islamic past impacted on the Maghreb. So more precisely, I began to look at Arabic chronicles to think about how they present the interventions of men, rather than women for the most part, and lineages aspiring to rule in relation to the urban. So how are North African cities imagined, depicted, and also inhabited over the longue durée? And what references do chroniclers make to the past, to the East, and so on? If that all sounds a little bit abstract, I'm going to move on and give lots of examples and explanations for what I mean by those starting points. I'm going to be a little bit ambitious and try and talk about many, many centuries in the course of the lecture. So it will be quite a quick tour of North African cities over time. I'm starting here, as you can see the first slide, a map of North Africa. Conveniently, Granada is also on the map, so you can see exactly where you are in relation to North Africa. And what this map is showing you is where the first Muslim settlements were situated. So if we're talking about the conquest era, as Arab, Muslim, and increasingly North African armies moved across from east to west, you can see on this map where they settled in the sort of the little circles on the map. So mostly late antique towns. So there wasn't much new building in this first phase, in the first century AH. However, there was some, and perhaps one of the most important points on this map is Kairouan in Tunisia, which I hope you can see. It's over there. Kairouan was understood as being very similar in conception to other garrison towns in the Islamic East. Places like Kufa and Basra in Iraq and Fustat in Egypt, which are called the Amsar in Arabic literature, or garrison towns as we often translate it. And these garrison towns are described in a very particular way in the sources. They're described as being simple, humble. These are myths, not necessarily facts, but there are myths about all houses being of equal height, all houses being built of simple materials. So there's an emphasis, if you like, on an ethos of egalitarianism and simplicity in the first descriptions of Islamic town foundation in Iraq and in Egypt, and that's transposed to Kairouan. There are also miraculous aspects in the foundation of the city of Kairouan, which reflect a sense within Arabic sources that the success of Islam and Muslims was divinely ordained. And I have some 9th century quotes for you, which give that sense of the miraculous, and also something coming out of the early Islamic period, the idea that founding a town is a way of transforming the wilderness into civilization. And that wilderness is not necessarily a natural wilderness, but it may be the wilderness of ignorance before people accepted Islam. So I'll read out a couple of these quotes. So one of the earliest sources on the history of North Africa, Ibn Abd al-Hakam, who was writing in Egypt in the 9th century, he says that Uqba, who was the founder of Kairouan and sort of a heroic figure in the conquest of the Maghreb, that Uqba called out at the top of his voice, "Oh, inhabitants of the valley, may God have mercy on you. Depart now, because we are settling here." He shouted this for 3 days until all the lions, wild creatures, and venomous reptiles had left. Then he ordered the people to clear the land and divide it into plots. And he transferred the people from the place that Muawiyah ibn Hudayj had settled to the site of Kairouan today. In another quote from Balavuri, who's actually an Eastern Islamic author, that the site was a jungle covered with tamarisks and other trees where nobody settled because of the lions, beasts, and deadly scorpions. Uqba ibn Nafi' was a righteous man whose prayers were answered, and he called on his Lord, and he made them all go away. Even the lions carried their young to escape from there. So there's this sort of mythical, miraculous image of a man standing and telling all the venomous wild animals to leave, and them all obeying him because he's divinely guided. And these kind of legends continue on for hundreds of years. We find them all the way up to the 14th century and onwards. An early 14th century source gives the story, "Oh, you snakes and lions, we are the companions of the Prophet of God. Peace be upon him. So move away from us as we are settling here. And if we find any of you afterwards, we will kill you." After this, the people witnessed an amazing event. The lioness obediently left the scrub carrying her cubs. The wolf left bearing her pups, and the snake left with her young. Uqba called to the people, "Allow them to pass unharmed." And the foundation of Kairouan also generated other myths about how one decides where to build a mosque and how one orients your great mosque in the correct direction of prayer, the Qibla, which should point, roughly speaking, towards Mecca. And a 12th century source talks about the mosque, where to build the mosque, how it should be oriented. And in this source, there's a dream scene with a divine personage coming to Uqba and saying, "Grasp the military standard in your hand and walk while you hear the phrase, 'God is great.' When it stops, plant the standard, and that shall be the location of your Qibla, your direction of prayer." And the Great Mosque of Kairouan becomes a hugely symbolic building for other urban builders across North Africa, but also for later regimes within what's now Tunisia itself. An 11th century source, Al-Bakri, says that even though people kept on rebuilding the Great Mosque of Kairouan, sorry, I have a bit more information about this here, that is the Great Mosque of Kairouan in the photograph. And even though the mosque was rebuilt repeatedly, they preserved the, they kept on saying that they were preserving the original direction of prayer as defined by Uqba, but they wanted to give their own mark to the mosque because they wanted it to be among their building projects as rulers. So this already leads us to a sense that the founder of a city has a responsibility to found its great mosque, and I would add to that a suitable residence. You can see on the slide it says the governorial residence or the Dar al-Imara, which in these early cities tended to be adjacent or near to the great mosque, creating a great mosque governorial residence combination, which we find replicated time and time again across North Africa. I want to move on now to the 2nd and 3rd centuries AH, or the 8th and 9th centuries CE. And this is a very, very interesting period in which we see much more urban foundation going on across North Africa under the auspices of the regime, well, most of the regimes that you can see on the slide, the Ibadi Rustamids, the Idrisids, and the Midrarids. These towns are built by opponents of the Abbasid caliphs in the east, and the rulers of each of these different entities perceived themselves as being religious as well as political leaders. A lot of them were called imams, a term which encompasses a sense of both political and religious leadership, and they self-consciously positioned themselves against the caliphs in the Islamic East. And in the urban in the urban myths associated with their towns, we'll find two main features. One, an appeal to the simplicity of the early Amsar that I've mentioned already in the case of Kairouan. And then secondly, a later claim that these new towns in North Africa have as much nobility, wealth, and material elegance as well-known Eastern centres. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So if we think first of all about Rustamid Tahat, this is a newly built city, although it was close to a late antique settlement of some kind. And in the foundation myths of Tahat, we find the ethos of the humble builder transposed to North Africa. The supposed founder of the city, Ibn Rustam, the founder also of the Rustamid dynasty, is described receiving visitors as he humbly plastered the roof of his own home. So he's not a ruler who sits back and orders other people to do all the hard work. He's getting his hands dirty. He's plastering. And that's considered a mark of his humility and also of his legitimacy. He's modelling a type of rulership which is egalitarian and democratic, rather than the kind of rulership that was being critiqued, which was the rule of the Abbasids in Baghdad, which was seen as being a very luxurious city with big palaces and lots of rich materials, and that was seen as something to criticise by the Rustamids. However, in the next phase, Tahat grew as a town, it became more impressive, and then it was consistently compared to Basra in Iraq as being as wealthy as Basra, as having as beautiful buildings as Basra. So there's this reference point. There was actually also, from a demographic perspective, a lot of migration from Basra in Iraq to Tahat, which is sometimes called the Basra of the Maghreb. So there are strong connections there, but the important thing is this idea that the foundation myth can be seen as criticising Abbasid indulgence in luxuries in the Islamic East, but the city itself then subsequently comes to be seen as comparable or perhaps a replica of Basra in Iraq. If we move on to Midrarid Sijil Masa, this is described initially as, again, being very simple, very humble, very basic when it was first built. Again, like one of the garrison towns in the Islamic East. But then that city also has a second phase in which it becomes much more splendid and grows and becomes a very important commercial centre on the northern Saharan fringe. It is, in fact, very important in trading across the Sahara and is a major entrepot in the trans-Saharan trade routes. So it is a town which has a lot of money pouring into it. And it then starts to be described in sources as being very like Kufa in Iraq. And you'll find descriptions in, say, al-Bakri writing in the 11th century or some earlier 10th century Islamic geographers from the East describing Kufa, Sijil Masa, as having tall, lofty houses like those of Kufa. So again, we find these new reference points. But the fact that the city is growing and is grand is also seen as a mark of the success of the ruling family, the Midrarids, and their legitimacy is to a certain extent connected to their foundation of a town. We can see similar things happening in the case of Idris al-Faz, further to the north. Idris ibn Abdullah was a descendant of the Prophet who migrated from the Islamic East or sought refuge possibly from Abbasid persecution and ultimately settled in Volubilis in northern Morocco, an old Roman town, but then subsequently founded his own new city, the city of Fez, which was then augmented and expanded by his son Idris II. We know very little about Fez, but it initially was composed of 2 little townships, and Idris II named his township Al-Alia. Now, Al-Alia refers to the name Ali and is kind of indicating Idris's descent from the Prophet Muhammad through his son-in-law Ali. But there was also a section of the city of Medina in Arabia which was called Al-Alia. So there's also a transposition of the name to Fez to kind of enhance the meanings around this new Idrisid city. Just to emphasize the importance of founding towns for the legitimacy of these different regimes, whether Rustamid, Midrarid, or Idrisid, I'll just make quick reference to the Bagawata. Now, the Bagawata are a very interesting group of tribes who resided on the Atlantic plains of what's now Morocco. They were probably a similar religious sect to the Rustamids and the Midrarids, a group called collectively the Kharijites. But the Bagawata had no town. The ruling family did not found a town. They didn't have an identifiable capital. As a result, they didn't accumulate a group of scholars around them. There are no chronicles written from their perspective, and subsequently they become denigrated in the sources as heretics. So they do not have that central place with a scholarly cohort who can write about them positively, and they never really become accepted as rulers of Muslim orientation, although that's how they describe themselves. The only reference we have to them describing themselves is an emissary to 10th century Cordoba, who very much asserted that the Bagawata were Muslim, but subsequently they get gradually described as not Muslim at all. And I would argue that's partly because they don't have this urban centre like the Midrarids have in Sijil Masa, or the Rustamids in Tahat, or the Idrisids in Fez. If we move on a century, if we look at the 10th century CE, the 4th century AH, things change considerably in this century. The emergence of 2 very large regimes who are imperial, both of whom claim to be caliphs, denoting their claim to universal religio-political status within the Islamic world in its entirety. The Umayyads, based here in the Iberian Peninsula with their capital at Cordoba, and the Fatimids. Now, the Fatimids often in the literature are very much associated with Egypt, but many people don't pay so much attention to the Fatimids 10th century, where they were based in North Africa. They were based in what's now Tunisia, where they built 2 grand capitals, Al-Mahdiya and then Al-Mansuriya, which were comparable to Madinat al-Zahra, built by the Umayyads outside Cordoba. So there's a lot of imperial building going on. And politically, what happens in this century is that tribal chiefs across all of North Africa begin to see their prospects as being connected to an alliance with one of these big imperial powers. So we have local chiefs who want to enhance their status, and instead of setting themselves up entirely independently, they choose to become governors on behalf of the Fatimids, or governors on behalf of the Umayyads, which raises their status above their peers and enables them to claim to be kings of their own people. So, and this is a really interesting moment, and this is an aspect of Umayyad Fatimid competition, which is relatively understudied. A lot of attention has been paid to the Umayyad Caliphate within the Iberian Peninsula, and also the extension of an Umayyad protectorate over northern Morocco. And likewise, a lot of people studied the Fatimids in Tunisia and then subsequently in Egypt and Syria. But the impact of their rise on tribal chiefs in the intervening space is less well studied, which is why I'm not focusing on the Umayyad or Fatimid imperial cities as such today, but I'm looking at some of the spaces in between, which are actually very interesting. So on this side, I'm thinking about the Sanhaja. The Zirids were a chiefly lineage from the Sanhaja, and they founded a city called Ashir in two phases. So Ziri ibn Manad founded Ashir first time round, about 935, and his son Buligin founded another city nearby in the 970s. But importantly, the Zirids did that because they'd been recognized as Fatimid governors across North Africa, which had given them enhanced status among the Sanhaja tribes. And they actually used Fatimid material assistance to build Ashir. And it seems that the Fatimids themselves were actually very keen to do this. In particular, the Fatimid Caliph Al-Qa'im, he sent architects, he sent laborers, he sent material resources to the Zirids, and this is something he'd already done with other people. He'd already invested in the rebuilding of some other towns in North Africa, like Msila, and then he empowered the Zirids to enhance Ashir. I can't really stress enough how unusual and frontier-like the location of Ashir is. That image is of Ziri ibn Manad's palace foundations at Ashir. This may have been, he may have been reworking an older site. We don't really know for sure. There's been some interesting archaeological work done in the area. But in any case, it seems to have been a grand site where Ziri ibn Manad could really perform monarchy, where he could really be a king before the Sanhaja tribes who came to pay their allegiance to him there, not just as Fatimid governor, but also as king of the entire group. And a lot of other scholars have mentioned this. Lucien Golvin and other scholars have mentioned this idea of the Zirids as being kings in their own domain and using their relationship with the Fatimids to make that point really strongly. Was the city sectarian? The Fatimids are Shi'i. The Zirids acknowledged the Fatimids and therefore were responsible for promoting Fatimid Shi'ism in central North Africa. Well, it's hard to say. There's so little left of Ashir. We can't really talk of a Shi'i urban plan or direct comparators to Al-Mahdiya or Al-Mansuriya, the Fatimid cities in Tunisia. But I have a very interesting quote from a geographer, a historian writing at this time, Muhammad ibn Yusuf al-Warraq, who died in 973. So, you know, he's very much a contemporary. He fled North Africa and went to live in Umayyad Cordoba because he wanted to escape from the surging Fatimid Shi'i power in North Africa. And he produced these two couplets. O you surging from our west, from that place of unbelief, Ashir, from the house of iniquity, the oppressor of its people, it was raised up for religious falsehood and distortion, founded by its accursed deviator. May God's curse fall on Ziri. Now, in English, the wordplay is completely lost. I guess the wordplay is probably completely lost in Spanish as well, but the Arabic root for the name Ziri is ZWR. The root for the word for distortion is exactly the same. The Arabic word is zawr, which is closely related to ziri. And deviator in Arabic is also ziri. That word can mean deviator. So ziri's actual name was probably an Amazigh or Berber name, but you can use you could take the Arabic root and create this whole wordplay in this poem around the fact that the man is deviant, the city's deviating, it's crooked, it's appalling, all because from the perspective of the writer, Al-Warraq, it's a outpost of Shiism in North Africa, and his attachments were Sunni. Further to the west, we have the Sanhaja tribes of what's now Morocco doing the same thing, but working with the Umayyads of Cordoba instead of working with the Fatimids. So the Umayyads also recruited allies, appointed them as governors within North Africa, particularly some lineages from the tribal group called the Maghrawa. And we see very similar things happening, both through strong desire of these governors to control the city of Fez, which was one of the most important towns in the region in this period, and then subsequently through the Maghrawa chief, Ziri ibn Atiyah's founding of Wajda as his own capital. I mean, Wajda is quite a small town now on the frontier between Morocco and Algeria, and there's nothing really left from this early phase, so it's difficult to give you an image, but the images that you can see on the slide are changes made by the Zenata chiefs as governors in Fez, most importantly, the adding of a taller tower minaret to the Great Mosque of Fez, the mosque now known as the Qarawiyyin, which was said to mimic the tower which had very recently been built for the Great Mosque of Cordoba. So creating a very visual symbol that the mosque was Umayyad and Sunni, and the town was also Umayyad and Sunni. I should point out, as it may not be obvious to you, that the Fatimids didn't use minarets in their early phase. They do build minarets later on, but in their first phase, the Fatimids considered minarets an illicit innovation to mosques, and they gave the call to prayer on either on a grand portal at the entrance to their mosque or a roof platform, but they didn't build towers. So the fact that this tower is installed in Fez is a really strong visual symbol for the population about the city's orientation. Ooh. Am I okay time-wise? Sorry, worried. I can get a bit carried away, and I could probably talk to you for the entire day, but you might prefer to have lunch at some point. So just let me know if I'm going on too far. So I want to move now to the 11th century, the 5th century AH, the Almoravids. And as you can see on the slide, these are northern Saharan tribes. They're Sanhaja, but not at all the same Sanhaja as the Zirids. They're camel nomads of the Sahara, who were probably Islamized early in the 11th century. We don't know very much about the processes by which they converted to Islam, when it actually took place. Generally, when communities did convert, they tended to then back project their conversion to earlier times. So nobody wanted to admit they had just converted to Islam. So it's difficult to unpick the stories and legends, but I think there's a scholarly consensus that these tribes are probably converted either in the late 10th or early 11th centuries. And a local network of teaching centres called Rabats were particularly important in this process of conversion in the deep south of Morocco and the northern Sahara. A Rabat is a frontier post. What that meant in different times and places varies extensively. But in southern Morocco, it seems to mean primarily a place for the promulgation of an simple Islamic education, some basic information about Islam. It doesn't seem to be particularly militant necessarily, but there are other rabats where people gathered to wage war against those they considered non-Muslim. And there may be elements of that in the south here too. We know that there were rabats just north of the Bagwata territory. Remember the poor old Bagwata who thought they were Muslim, but no one else thought they were? There were rabats just north of Bagwata territory where people gathered to wage war against the Bagwata tribes. But the rabats of the deep south seem to have been religiously connected to Kairouan in Tunisia. They may also have had connections with Umayyad Cordoba. And by connections, I mean people moving between these places who had been educated in Kairouan, educated in Cordoba, but who then moved down to the frontier as a pious duty to spread Islam, teach peoples on the frontier about the faith and convert them. And this leads on in the 1040s and 1050s to the consolidation of a movement known as that of the men of the Rabat, al-Murabitun, from which we get the term al-Moravids. And as a number of Sanhaja tribes come together under the banner of this movement, they do also begin to engage in increasingly important urban initiatives. The Almoravid form of Islam is similar to that of Kairouan and Cordoba in that they are adherents of the Maliki school of law, which is one of the four major Sunni schools of Islamic law. So they're Maliki in profile. And some of the early places that are associated with the movement are Azougui in Mauritania, and that pile of rubble is what's left of Azougui. It's sometimes called a rabat, it's sometimes called a fortress, it's sometimes called the Saharan capital of the Almoravids, particularly if you're Mauritanian. So there are different claims made about Azougui. We don't really know how big or substantial it was, but it did have a scholarly group who lived there. We know that at least one important scholar, Al-Muradi, was the judge of Azougui in the mid-11th century. So it was not insignificant. There are also legends of a mysterious town that's never been identified that was founded by the religious leader of the early Almoravid movement, Ibn Yasin, a place called Aratnana. And what's interesting about Aratnana is how the legends about it are almost exactly similar to some of the legends around the foundation of Kufa and Basra, Kufa in particular. This idea that I mentioned at the beginning, all houses must be of equal height, they must all be simply built, there must be an ethos of egalitarianism and simplicity in the city for it to be truly Muslim. In the 1050s, the Almoravids gradually moved northwards and began to capture established trading towns, Audagust, south of the Sahara, in what's now the Sahel, Sijin Masa, which we've already encountered, and another market town north of the High Atlas Mountains, Agmat. So Agmat was divided into two, and the place where the Almoravids resided was the larger of the two settlements of Agmat, Agmat Warika, or Urika, as it's called today in Morocco. And they resided there for around a decade. So when you're looking back at the 11th century, a decade seems like that. But of course, if you're actually experiencing that time period, a decade is not a short time. You know, that's quite a long time to live somewhere. The excavations, and you can see some images there of the excavations at Agmat, include a a bathhouse, that's on the right, and then in the centre, the palace at Agmat. And you have a palace, a bathhouse, and a great mosque, all in very close proximity to each other, divided by a small modern street. And they may have already been, archaeologists think that they may have been there before the Almoravid period, but were probably enhanced and enlarged by the Almoravids. So they are beginning to become much more familiar with urban life in Agmat. They're living in a palace, they have a huge bathhouse, and the Great Mosque is there for them to think about what great mosques look like, how you might want to build a monumental great mosque. And so we can see sort of three different ideas in play when they come to founding their own city, Marrakesh. And the meaning of Marrakesh, as Moroccan scholars have sort of discovered in the last sort of 10, 15 years, is domain of God. The term comes from Amazigh terms, Yakush Amur, which mean, when they're put together, domain of God. And it's actually, if we're thinking about the way different sources describe things, if you read the Arabic chronicles, the name of Marrakesh is always dismissed and demeaned, because most of our sources come from the 12th century and are written by the successors and the opponents of the Almoravids. So in later sources, you'll find the name Marrakesh described as meaning, oh, it was the name of a bandit who used to live there. Oh, it's from a Berber term for running fast. I mean, who names their city running fast? I mean, if you've ever found, I mean, some towns and villages do have quite odd names, it's true. But it's quite unlikely that you would build your own capital city and then name it after a bandit or a phrase meaning running fast. I think we would all agree that if you're building a grand capital to express your identity as a regime, domain of God sounds a lot more likely. So, anyway, we're going to go with domain of God rather than anything else. But what are the ideas they have to play with when they found it? They have the notion of the Rabat, which dates to their origins. But they also have the idea of the Misr, which is the singular term for Amsar, these garrison towns founded in the early Islamic period, whether in North Africa or in the Islamic East. But they also have an aspiration to something else, an imperial capital, a Hadra, something more like the grand cities of the Umayyads and the Fatimids. And this is a slide where you can see a plan of Almoravid Marrakesh. The green circles show you where they built their what we would call their Dar al-Imara, their seat of government, which is the lower of the two green circles. And then the upper green circle is where they founded their great mosques. So this is quite interesting. It's a little bit different to how other cities were founded. If we're thinking of the Amsar model, where, if you recall, I said that the great mosque and the house of the governor or the ruler tended to be next door to each other. Here we find that whole plan kind of stretched open. And that seems to relate in part to the nature of the Almoravids themselves as a nomadic group who projected their own power to their own kinsmen and other tribal groups through parading through the city backwards and forwards between the Great Mosque and their fortress. Now, their fortress was said to be the only more substantial building in the early town. So this is another evoking of the early Amsar. And you can see some extracts there, which do relate back to some of the ideas I've already mentioned, although in a later 11th century setting. You'll notice in the top extract this quote from al-Bakri in the 1060s that they choose a desert place. There's nothing there apart from gazelles and ostriches. There's no plants except thorn, which is not the nicest of plants, and colecanth, which kind of grows along the ground. But it's strategic. There's a river valley that can be its garden, the Nafis River Valley. The Dukala Plain can be its fields. And the reins of the Jabal Daran, which means the High Atlas, will be forever in the hands of its master. So it has strategic value, but it's very much conceptualized as being arid, dry, like a desert. And if you remember when I talked about the myths of the foundation of Kairouan, we looked at this idea of, a jungle, a wilderness, getting the wild animals to go away. And this is a variation on that theme. Marrakesh did have some water, obviously, because you cannot build a city if you have absolutely no water. You have to have water. But then in the second extract here, you can see this idea of the Almoravid rulers as being humble and involved in building. So the city's simple. It began with the Casa al-Hajja. That's the substantial royal fortress and residence. But you can see that the ruler, the Emir, Abu Bakr ibn Umar, riding out with chiefs and labourers. So he's getting involved with the actual work. And we find similar references to his successor, here on the next slide, Yusuf bin Tashfin, building the mosque. And it says here that when he, God's mercy upon him, initiated the construction of the mosque, he got involved with making the bricks. He's not sitting back and just ordering people around. This is a deliberate way to enhance his legitimacy. He was groveling around making bricks with everyone else. So again, it's referring back to these notions of the ruler as a humble builder involved in creating a simple town, which is expressing the idea that it is simple, pious, truly a domain of God, as they had named it. So we have these different tropes that we've already encountered. At the top of the slide, I also mentioned something else. In a lot of medieval urban foundation narratives or narratives of founding new buildings, there are these ideas of overcrowding. So one of the justifications for building this city was that Agmat, where they'd been living, had become overcrowded. This is not always necessarily the case, but it's a way of neutrally explaining a change. The slide isn't Marrakesh, by the way, but it just gives you a flavour of the simplicity of early Marrakesh. But Marrakesh doesn't remain simple. I also mentioned the idea of the imperial capital, the Hadra, something more splendid, something, that can be counted among the great cities of the Islamic world. And that change begins to occur in Marrakesh under Yusuf bin Tashfin's son, Ali ibn Yusuf, who ruled from 1106 to 43, as you can see. He very much expanded the initial fortress on the edge of the city, the Casa al-Hajjar, into a much more palatial space, probably recruiting artisans from the Iberian Peninsula, from here, from Al-Andalus. He also greatly developed the water supply to the city because as it grew, the streams and rivers feeding the site were not adequate. Needed to get more water from the Atlas foothills. But he also rebuilt what's generally described as quite a simple first mosque with a huge monumental great mosque. The Masjid al-Sakaya, which means the fountain mosque because it had a beautiful fountain, and a nearby ablutions area called the Almoravid Pavilion or Qubba. We always talk about the Qubba quite a lot because it's the only thing left from this period. So you can see a little image there of the pavilion. And you can see, this is not anymore a simple mud brick building. This is actually something much grander. You can see where it's situated in the city. It's in the city where that red circle is on the bigger image, and you can see a large great mosque next to that circle, just above it, and that's a modern mosque built in the Alawi period in the 18th century, but on the site of the Masjid as-Sakaya, or the Almoravid Fountain Mosque. And Ali also got involved in quite a lot of infrastructural projects. He's always described as building a wonderful bridge over the Tansift River. I won't get into it now because we don't have time, but bridge building is something that rulers often did to enhance their status. And even here, of course, one of the first things the Muslim governors of Cordoba did was renovate the Roman bridge. So bridges are really important for access, but they are also monumental projects which rulers like to get involved with, again, to enhance their legitimacy. And we can get some sense of how splendid Marrakesh may have been under the Almoravids from great mosques that they built, which remain in other places. The images on the right are the Great Mosque of Algiers, and the interior picture is the dome preceding the mihrab or prayer niche in the Great Mosque of Tlemcen in western Algeria. So that gives you a sense of their aesthetics, which were lavish. And these aesthetics are very much seen as connecting up with a number of different wider Islamic aesthetic traditions. One, Cordoba. The Almoravids were in a dialogue with the Umayyad past in Cordoba and the Iberian Peninsula. They imported marble pieces from the Iberian Peninsula quite regularly to insert in their buildings. But they also have been described as being in conversation with the Islamic East in this period. And this is a period where what's called the Sunni revival is taking place. And certain forms of decoration are particularly associated with that Sunni revival. And we can see traces of them in Almoravid buildings. So you can see some ways in which one might see the Almoravids as projecting a sense of Sunni Maliki identity through the way they enhance and build their cities. This is another slide giving you a sense of how splendid the era was. This is a minbar, or a pulpit, which was commissioned by Ali bin Yusuf for the Fountain Mosque in Marrakesh from artisans in Cordoba. I would make one small point here. This Almoravid use of materials and craftsmanship from the Iberian Peninsula has sometimes been seen in terms of the Almoravids not being able to do anything themselves. I would just point out that no one would ever say that the Romans couldn't do anything for themselves because they imported red granite columns from southern Egypt. Using the resources of your empire is done by all empires. It's not about not being able to do things for yourself. If you are incorporating great traditions and areas which have a wonderful aesthetic heritage, you normally draw that into your own creativity to make the mark that you have become masters of that area and can commission those items. So I don't see the Almoravids as unable to do stuff because they recruited people from Tunisia or from the Iberian Peninsula into their imperial elite or into their corps of craftsmen, but more as a natural imperial development. If we move speedily on to the 12th century and the Almohads are movement is primarily supported by tribes from the Masmuda group who live in the high Atlas Mountains of Morocco and the valley to the south of that, the Souss Valley. And this movement arose in the 1120s, and its leader, Ibn Tumart, was of the Masmuda people, and he was very critical of the Almoravids on a number of different points. He was recognized ultimately in the 1120s as the Mahdi, Muslim equivalent, if you like, of a Messiah. And the Almohad movement thus was conceptualized as a complete renewal of authentic Islam. It's almost like returning the clock to its starting point. Earlier Almohad coins have no date on them. They don't use the Islamic date or any other date because it's this idea it's a completely new era. It's taking Islam back to the beginning and restarting it. And in a lot of the writings produced by Almohad chroniclers, Ibn Tumart's life is presented as a replay of the life of the Prophet Muhammad. So Tin Mel, the movement's first town up in the high Atlas Mountains, and that the image there is of the mosque of Tin Mel, was understood as a new Medina. So it's imagined as Medina in Arabia, and Ibn Tumart is replaying the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and the various stages in his life are therefore mapped onto various stages in the life of the Prophet as well. When Ibn Tumart died, he was followed by someone else, one of his disciples, Abdul Mu'min, and then there were 2 decades of war during which Abdul Mu'min led the Masmuda tribes in conquering most of the Almoravid Empire, both in North Africa and ultimately in the Iberian Peninsula. And the date we normally give for the ending of the Almoravid period and the start of the Almohad era is the capture of Marrakesh in 1147. So Marrakesh is near Masmuda territory. It makes sense as a capital. But the big question for the Almohads is, how do we make the Almoravid domain of God our domain of God when we completely reject everything the Almoravid stood for? So they have this sort of challenge. So the sources talk about Abdul Mu'min's approach to Marrakesh in an extremely confrontational way. It's difficult to find more confrontational narratives about a dynasty's interaction with a city than in the case of the Almohad capture of Marrakesh. That no quarter is given. Abdul Mu'min's, the memoir of Ibn Tumart, which includes information about the subsequent conquest of Marrakesh, talks about Abdul Mu'min refusing to enter the city because all its mosques were wrongly oriented. And you might remember now this idea of deviance, which we saw with Zirid Ashir. And we have it again here with the Almohads basically saying that the Almoravids were deviant and all their mosques were like wrongly oriented. They were also deviant. And that sort of physical misorientation is like the physical expression of their overall deviance and ignorance and wrong approach to Islam. So it's very, very polemical and rhetorical. And in fact, some of the things the Almohads say about the Almoravids is, their prayer direction was more Jewish than Muslim. It's completely in the wrong direction. And so they close the Sakaya Mosque. This is as if a beautiful new cathedral has just been built. And then within 5 years, someone comes along and goes, no, all wrong, locks it up. And it's just sitting there, this beautiful building, locked. So the Almohad's like, no, we need a new mosque. So they build the Kutubiyya. And you can see an image there of the Kutubiyya, an aerial view on the right. That's actually only half the Kutubiyya. That's actually the second prayer hall, built around 1158. I don't know if you can see, but it's a bit gloomy. But the other side of the minaret, the left-hand side, are the archaeological remains of the first prayer hall. So it was absolutely massive. And the minaret tower was actually between the two halves of the building. And that first bit that's now ruined was commenced around 1148 next to the old Almoravid fortress. Now, interestingly enough, the Almohads are happy to live in the Almoravid fortress. A fortress isn't a religious space. The palace is the palace. So they inhabit the palace quite happily for quite some time. But they don't accept the Almoravid mosque, and they rebuild the Kutubiyya next to it. Abdul Mu'min is also said to have invested in the building of suburban estates around Marrakesh. And we can see these as perhaps similar to the idea of the Munya in Umayyad al-Andalus, the idea of the suburban estate which produces fruit, vegetables, and so on. But the Baha'ir, and that word is the plural word in a plural for the word Buhaira, which means a lake. So these are the lake estates, because they all have a huge artificial reservoir within them, which is used for watering the trees, the olive trees, the fruit trees, and any other produce that's being grown within the estate, but also provides a space for leisure. We have like reports of people boating, swimming, generally having fun on the lakes of Buhaira, of the Baha'ir estates. They're also really practical because they're where the armies muster. Because they have the water, because they have the space and the produce. If an army is mustering and thousands of troops are gathering, you can make tent cities in your lake estate. So they're multifunctional and very, very useful to the Almohads. But in terms of how we understand cities, they're also very deliberately described in the sources as part of a process of transforming the desert to a garden. So in Almohad sources, the Almoravid contribution to bringing water to Marrakesh or founding estates is completely ignored. And the building of these great estates and bringing water is all attributed to the Almohads. And there's one lovely quote from a 12th century geographer called Muhammad ibn Abdurrabbi, which describes, he says, before the Almohads built these wonderful estates, a bird flying over the plain of Marrakesh would plummet out of the sky from the heat and thirst. But now they're able to fly over and, feel the fresh greenness of the area. So there's this idea of transformation again, of wilderness, desert, to a well-watered, civilized, productive environment. You can also see here a plan of the Almohad city with some pointers to where the Almohads, as opposed to the Almoravids, built. So the upper green circle is the Palace Kutubiyya area, and the lower green circle is the more imperial part of town, which was built subsequently by Abdul Mu'min's successors. And that more southerly area was a royal enclave, sometimes called Tamarakusht in the sources, sometimes called As-Saliha, and sometimes just called the Qasaba, or the citadel. And this was very much extended during the 1180s and 90s, first by Abdul Mu'min's son, Abu Yaqub Yusuf, and then by his grandson, Abu Yusuf Yaqub. And you can see here how grand this might have been. This is one of the few remaining Almohad gates in Marrakesh, the Bab Agnal, which was probably the gate into the royal quarter in the late 12th century. Many more estates were built, lake estates, and you can see an image of the most famous lake estate on the other side. That's the Manara Gardens outside Marrakesh today. So the pavilion is actually much, much later. So the pavilion is not an Almohad pavilion, but there were pavilions there in the Almohad period. And at this point, there are also many other additions made to the city. And these are institutions already familiar from the Islamic East. And this is just the time when Ibn Jubayr went from Granada to the Islamic East on pilgrimage, wrote his account of that journey, and began to describe in great detail things like hospitals and madrasas, or theological colleges. And this is the first written record we have of someone from the West really going into lots of detail. Salah ad-Din has built this wonderful hospital in Cairo, and it's got 3 rooms, and it's got water, and it's got plants, and it's got blankets, and, you know, very detailed discussions. Also talks about the Caesarea, or covered ruler's market, and various other things. And they all suddenly appear in Marrakesh shortly after Ibn Jubayr's trip to the Islamic East, and his very, very detailed descriptions of all these buildings. And myself and some other scholars have written about this very much in terms of the Almohad ruler, Abu Yusuf Yaqub, seeing Almohad Marrakesh as the foremost city in the Islamic world. This is indicated by the use of the phrase city of cities. It's described in Arabic as Misr al-Amsar, or city of cities. But we also have to just be cognizant of what was happening in the Islamic East at this time. The Almohad Empire was the biggest empire in the Islamic world in the 12th century. The Islamic East was politically fragmented. The Crusaders were all over the place. The Seljuks were, you know, divided into warring factions. So actually, if you wanted to look at a map of the Islamic world in this period and say, where is there a stable, large empire, you would have looked at North Africa. And this is something that's usually missed out of general histories of the Islamic world. But the Almohads were really, really important. So Abu Yusuf Yaqub wasn't just, you know, completely overstating the power of his empire and the importance of his capital. It was actually very, very important in the period. I have one last slide, and then I'm going to finish, because I just want to say how this era comes to its close with the Marinids between the 13th and 15th centuries. And what's really interesting, if we're looking at narratives about cities, is how they adopt a completely different narrative. And that is a narrative of restoration. They don't claim to be religio-political rulers. They don't claim to be caliphs or to have any claim to universal status. They would like to expand their power across all of North Africa and the southern Iberian Peninsula, but generally fail to do that. But within Fez, an old city, which they choose as their capital, the narrative is completely different. They do build a new royal city, which we know as New Fez today, but in Old Fez, they focus very much more on renewing older traditions. In particular, the Idrisid era in Fez, but also the period of the Zanata governors, whom I mentioned, the Magrawa, who had been so important in the city in the 10th and early 11th centuries. So what do? They repair the Great Mosque of Fez. They don't build a new one. They repair it. They don't look anywhere. They try and give the existing Great Mosque nice additions, new elements, a new ablutions building, a new library, a new Quran store. They gift beautiful Quranic manuscripts to the Qarawiyyin. So they try to present themselves as giving graciously to the Qarawiyyin mosque, not contesting its status or building something different. They also enhance the religious infrastructure by building a large number of madrasas in Fez. They build madrasas elsewhere, but in Fez, they really build many, many madrasas or theological colleges. And if you go to Fez today, those are the highlights of the tourist track, basically, the madrasas, whether the Atarin or the Bu'inaniya, Misbahiyya. I mean, there's numerous madrasas, and that is actually an image from the Bu'inaniya madrasa in Fez. they also offer patronage to shrines, which is a new type of institution which we don't see in earlier cities, which relates to the growth of popular piety, notions of sainthood in the medieval Islamic world, which rulers then begin to work with to do different types of building. So that brings me to my close. Just want to recap on some of the points I've made. So I say that if you look at political developments in North Africa from the conquest up to the 14th century, you can see ways in which they connect up with urban developments. I would say personally, and others may argue with me, that city foundation and recognition as a ruler often went hand in hand, and that the myths that are associated with the foundation of any particular city refer to the Islamic past in a multitude of different ways. But that's a sort of very general point, and I would also say that not every aspiring dynasty uses the same tropes or uses them in exactly the same way. So we have an early situation where, with Tahat or Sijil Masa or Faz, people are looking to Kairouan or the Iraqi garrison towns of Kufa and Basra for inspiration, while also criticizing Baghdad in some cases. But then we have a period in the 10th century where Fatimid and Umayyad governors are looking to Fatimid and Umayyad capitals, learning from them, thinking about them, and also perhaps even using material resources sent by the Umayyad or Fatimid rulers to help them enhance their status with new buildings and new towns. By the time you reach the 11th century, things have changed again, and we have these dynasties from the Moroccan south, the Sanhaja Almoravids, and then the Masmuda Almohads, who are rivals of each other. And we can then see Marrakesh as being a really interesting place to explore all these ideas, sort of working together and against each other in one place, with Marrakesh's foundation by the Almoravids in sort of around 1070, using notions of the Rabat and the Misr, building towards a Hadra or an imperial capital. And then we see with the Almohads them reshaping the city to say that they're not Almoravid, that they're not like the Almoravids, but then also trying to create a centre which is worthy of being seen as an Islamic capital within the entire Islamic world. And then finally, post-Almohad era dynasties like the Marinids, who adopt completely different ways of working with the urban, working with urban tradition, myths and legends, and create an entirely new narrative of restoration of a largely imagined Sunni Maliki past in Fez, which had already been sponsored by the Idrisids and the Zenata. So I shall now stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Amira, for your very interesting presentation.
And before opening the debate, I would like to ask you myself two questions, and maybe we can manage the debate from there. The first one, it's a really simple one. You were talking about how the Almoravids, for example, built a Sunni Maliki city. So how would you distinguish a Sunni Maliki city from a Shiite city? For example, we might have many examples of the Fatimids. So how would you describe their differences? And the other one, you were talking about the building of Tahart by the Rustumids. And I really, it's fascinating the contrast they wanted to show between the Abbasids and themselves. and like the ritual and luxurious indulgences. While despite they later grew cities compared with Eastern cities as well. So while these groups who did not build cities, like you mentioned the Bahawata, it's really interesting, they were not considered Muslims. But these groups who in fact built cities, how did they articulate this paradox? Because later they became they mimicked the building of cities such as the Abbasids or other caliphal dynasties. So is there any articulation between this paradox in sources? Thank you.
Thank you so much. No, those are excellent questions. I'll be chronological, so I'll take the second first. Think about Tahat. I think in the stories of the founding of Tahat, and the person who's really studied this is Cyril Aye, so I'm very much drawing on his research about Rustamid Tahat. The way the foundation is described is primarily about legitimizing Ibn Rustam. So it's almost not about the city, it's more about Ibn Rustam and the idea that he's an imam, a religio-political leader, who's more pious, more suitable, more, a better man to lead than the Abbasid Caliph, because he is prepared to be involved with the plastering of his own roof. And these simple images actually relate back to, for the most part, to the second caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, and some directives that he gave, which are preserved in early Islamic sources, about building out of humble materials, building houses of one story, and so on and so forth. But also in some of the descriptions of the foundation of Kufa by Saif ibn Umar, who was an Eastern writer, and one of my colleagues, Edward Zikovitz-Coghill, has written about how Saif is criticizing the Abbasids by saying when Kufa was founded, it was very simple and basic and appropriate. And so Cyril Aye is arguing really that that sort of idea is lifted and transposed to Tahat. But subsequently, legitimizing the Rustamids isn't necessarily the main objective of geographers who are writing about Tahat. And those authors are more concerned to connect Tahat to Basra because they're both centers of Ibadi Kharijism. And there are human connections between them, with people moving between Basra in Iraq and Tahat. And then you find those same geographers sort of saying it's not just people, but the city itself looks like Basra in Iraq. So, but it's part of, I think, it is a paradox, but I think we're looking at slightly different eras and the different purposes of the sources involved. On that, Almoravid Marrakesh is a Sunni Maliki city. You may all have noticed I put a question mark after that because it is debatable whether you can say that. The things that I would point to, which I think are quite interesting, are not so much in the physical city itself, but in the way things are described as being done. For instance, when Ali bin Yusuf builds his beautiful new fountain mosque, he's said to have consulted with jurists. Any of you who are familiar with the history of Umayyad Cordoba may know that when Al-Hakam II was going to expand the Great Mosque of Cordoba, he's also described as consulting with jurists. So we have this sort of repeated notion that if you're a Sunni Maliki ruler, you consult with jurists. You don't just go off and do things however you might like to do them. You have this juridical underpinning to what you do, and that's a Maliki juridical underpinning. So the Masjid al-Saqaya is described as being oriented in the proper Maliki way. So I think you can see that in that orientation, there's an effort to refer to Sunni Malikism, I don't necessarily agree with some of the arguments that, you know, the finer details of the architecture are making reference to developments in the Islamic East. There's a lot of discussion by scholars and art historians about use of stalactite moulding, what we call makarnas, and that's sometimes associated with the Sunni Seljuks in the east and is sort of migrating westwards. But there's a huge amount of debate around that. And I would just say, for the average person in Almoravid buildings, they probably wouldn't realise that that might have been something used in Baghdad, because the vast majority of them had never been to Baghdad. On the other hand, if they saw marble pillars in the Umayyad Cordoban design, then I think they might well have understood that there was a physical reference there to being part of the Umayyad Cordoban tradition. So I think they kind of refer to Maliki Sunnism in some material ways and in some of the ways they do things. But that doesn't mean the whole city really is Sunni Maliki, hence my big question mark. Thanks.
Bueno, está abierto el...
Now the Q&A session is open. So if anyone would like to ask a question, if you want to ask a question, please speak loud, because there are no microphones available. But if the question is not well held, we will repeat that so that it can be heard in the microphone. It's like I say in class, all questions are good questions. You can ask in Spanish if you like. I have a question for you.
Son, en un momento, tienen una finalidad que es civilizar un terreno que ya está salvático. Pero eso se produce siempre, cada vez que los árabes van saliendo del territorio, o existe una mentalidad distinta cada vez que llegan a un territorio. Por ejemplo, eso en España es muy difícil que se dé.
The trope of the civilizatorial way of building cities against wilderness. So he was asking if this is
rhetorical.
Yeah, if this is. I mean, he asked if this is something that always happen in every place where the Muslims go, or if it's something just more in the East or North Africa. If it's something real or not, it's just rhetorical. Maybe he didn't understand this well, so you can.
I have to admit, I haven't studied urban myths across the entire Islamic world, so I wouldn't like to say whether you find this to the same degree in the East as in the West. It is quite, I think it's quite frequent in Tahat, for instance, there's an odd reference to, maybe the term Tahat means lioness. And maybe the founders of Tahat also had to, get the lions to leave before they built Tahat. So, it is rhetorical. Most times we're not really talking about areas that look exactly like these myths or legends would suggest. Kairouan was built near the site of earlier settlements. We know that it reused a lot of Roman stone, so it's not really an entirely empty space. With Tahat, there are also accounts of its founders having to negotiate market dues and rents with local tribes, which again suggests a more inhabited environment than the myth suggests. So I think these are quite common. These tropes are quite common when we're talking about capital cities or cities that are important to a particular ruler. And I do think they are predominantly rhetorical and not about material reality, which can be quite different. So I think they are designed to convey this idea that the ruler is playing a transformational role. but I think it's quite specific to some of these North African sites. It's interesting, actually, that the founding of the garrison towns in Iraq is not depicted in a particularly miraculous way at all. And I guess what's interesting is even though in Marrakesh there's an idea of transformation, it's not expressed as in a miraculous way. It's not as if the Almoravid ruler arrives and tells wild animals to go. It's more just, this is a really scrubby, dry place, and they build a city here. So it kind of, there are differences in the specifics of each story. Thank you.
Más cosas.
Las primeras ciudades ha dicho que toman como modelo a Kairouan. ¿Tuvo que ver que Kairouan fuese considerada una ciudad sagrada o simplemente la tomaron como modelo debido al esplendor de dicha ciudad?
The first cities in the Maghreb took Kairouan as a model. So this was because the sanctity of Kairouan, because it was considered a saint, sacred city, or just because it was a really splendorous city, big city.
I'm not sure it's Kairouan itself which is important, or some of the legends associated with it, because I think it becomes a sacred city in some ways later on. Like that sort of sense of its sacrality only develops over time. And certainly under the Aghlabids, it's an important working capital. But I do think it also depends where you are in the Maghreb and at what point. So if we look at the legends of the foundation of Fez, which are mainly recorded much later, they pay much more attention to Medina in Arabia. There's no reference at all, really, to Kairouan. And also at a certain point, because there's so much traffic backwards and forwards across the Strait of Gibraltar, you see Cordoba playing a much more important role in people's imagination than Kairouan. So it sort of varies, I would say. And certainly in the Fatimid era, it's not Kairouan which is the model, it's the Fatimid capitals, which are Al-Mahdiya and Al-Mansuriya, which are then sort of points of inspiration, say, for the Zirids in Ashir. You know, the Zirids aren't really looking at Kairouan. They're paying attention to the Fatimid capitals and how the palaces have been arranged and what the names of the palaces are and things like that. So I guess it's just, I've covered such a wide period, but when you go into more detail on any single one of these stories, you begin to see more differences as well as sort of overarching similarities.
¿Buscan mejor compararla con Córdoba o otra ciudad de mejor del este que tenían la imperial con cierta gran importancia para ser el Cairo? Intentando mejor ser iguales, sino mejor, no de forma en la estructura de la ciudad, mejor de forma simbólica, o simplemente la ignoraban, simplemente querían tener la gran ciudad capital que fuera una gran ciudad imperial que podían decir que la suya tiene igual de importancia que la otra. En plan, compararse no tanto a nivel ideológico de construcción, sino decir que ellos son tan importantes. No sé si
difficult for the translator one. So, to what extent, when Marrakesh as an imperial city was built, they were looking to other imperial cities as Cordoba or Cairo or eastern cities, or it was just something of their own dynamic of building an imperial city for their own, or something like that?
Yeah. I think Marrakesh is really, it's just so very interesting because it is, a bit its own thing. Both the Almoravids and the Almohads are keen to build their own imperial capital, which has its own characteristics. I think the Almoravids are looking certainly to a certain extent towards Cordoba, as I mentioned in a previous answer. Possibly to the east, some people have suggested that they're also inspired by Qalat Bani Hamad in central Algeria, which is another place they may have looked towards. Because so much has been destroyed from the Almoravid era, it's quite difficult to say. When I say destroyed, I mean physically within Marrakesh, but also in terms of chronicles, other materials which would express the Almoravid view of their own city. It's difficult to say. I think the Almohads very much see Marrakesh as their own creation. But they are, I guess, it's only with the modern era that pure innovation has been seen as one's objective. You know, if somebody builds a building in the 20th century, they probably want it to look completely different to every other building and that, you know, and be really innovative. In this period, there's more evolution as opposed to innovation. But there are some things that I would say the Almohads do to make their own cities particularly distinctive. One would be the tall tower minarets. Those are not like anything in the Islamic East. So they're following a model that they have in their mind, which they see as being Islamic and imperial, but at the same time there's their own interpretation of what that means and their own development of unique designs for their great mosques, for their suburban estates. So they're ideas that are there in the ether that they can pick up either from the Iberian Peninsula or from the Islamic East, but they interpret them entirely independently and create something of their own, which, as I suggest, they at least claim is, you know, not simply a capital, but a significant Islamic capital of world status. We might disagree with them, but I think it must have been quite impressive in the day. Thank you.
Gracias.
La explico para que no sea más fácil. Ese traslado de piezas y arquitectos de Córdoba a la ciudad de Marrakech para su construcción en la época de los almorávides, a pesar de que los propios almorávides eran capaces de hacerlo solos por sí mismos, se debe a la idea de continuidad, de rememorar un pasado idílico, de legitimarse. ¿Cómo podríamos interpretarlo?
So this phenomenon of reusing Cordoban material in Almoravid times, it's because they try to remember a glorious past, try to claim this glorious past, the memory of this past, or how could we interpret this phenomenon?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I think by the 11th century, the Umayyad Caliphate has ended. So the Umayyads couldn't be a threat, so they can be a heritage which can be perpetuated. As I mentioned, the Almoravids do position themselves as Maliki and Sunni, so they have that connection with the Umayyad Caliphal past in the Iberian Peninsula. And I think they want to present themselves as perpetuating that tradition, as being its heirs, if you like. But they do also present themselves as lieutenants or deputies of the Abbasid caliphs in the east. So they sort of triangulate, if you like, between past and present and put themselves forward as these representatives of the Sunni tradition in the Maghreb. But as with their predecessors, they do that to enhance their own status as much as for any other reason. So this tradition is important to them as something to legitimize them and enhance their own reputation.
Estando aquí en Granada, a mí me gustaría saber, por ejemplo, si la dinastía nazarí se ha visto influenciada o inspirada en algún momento por los mediníes. Por ejemplo, en cuanto a la construcción de madrazas, sabiendo que en época mediní pues, se ha construido pues, demasiadas o muchas madrazas y ha habido también allí un crecimiento a nivel artístico y arquitectónico.
So, she's asking for the influence of Marinid building ways, artistic ways in the Nasrid Granada. So what you can say about this? Another talk.
That's a potentially contentious point. I think there's a lot of discussion around the Nasrids and the Marinids. I would say that the Strait of Gibraltar in this period is more of a bridge than a barrier, and that both dynasties look at each other, cross-communicate. We know that important individuals went backwards and forwards the whole time. Ibn al-Khatib would be an excellent example. We know that craftsmen went backwards and forwards. So I would say that there's a constant conversation going on, and that the Marinid madrasas can, it's annoying that you can't put a palace next to a palace. So we can't put the Alhambra next to the palace in Fez because it's still the royal palace and it's locked to, us ordinary people. So you can only really put the Alhambra next to the madrasas because, the madrasa here is only a small fragment is left. So it's difficult to compare similar things or buildings used for the same use. But the clear similarities in the architectural and decorative registers show that there's a lot of conversation going on across the Strait of Gibraltar. So I think it's actually important to see the Alhambra in particular as something that's in conversation with Marinid building of the same period, not something that relates solely to the history of the Iberian Peninsula, but also has this deep communication going on with developments across the Strait of Gibraltar.
Yo quería preguntar si a la hora de analizar estas primeras ciudades que se fundan en el Magreb y en toda la zona, hemos destacado la influencia de modelos orientales como Karawan. Pero mi pregunta va más bien porque me planteo si no estaríamos quizá omitiendo un poco la parte de continuidad y de herencia de la tradición romana, sobre todo en el modelo urbanístico en esta zona, sobre todo cuando hablamos de las regiones más cercanas a la Cartago romana.
When founding cities in the West, but what about the continuity with Roman models, or I would add even local models like Berber models?
Yeah. Thank you. No, that's an important question. There is a certain amount of continuity, but it's interesting that most of the late antique cities don't go on to become major Islamic centres. Arguably, one exception might be Tangier, which is a late antique town, but it's also an early Islamic garrison town as well. But many of the places that I've mentioned are new builds. They're described as new foundations in the Arabic sources. But medieval geographers are very, very aware of the Roman and late antique tradition in North Africa. I could have chosen a completely different set of cities and given a different talk, which would go into great detail about what we might call the traces of the ancients. There's a phrase that you find in a lot of these sources, Athar al-Awa'il, which means sort of traces of the ancients, and it is about how Muslims in North Africa looked at earlier periods and looked at the past and what's remembered, what's forgotten. There's a recognition of grandeur, hydraulic engineering. In the period, in terms of the cities that I'm looking at, it's not so evident, but the Almohads in some places were extremely interested in hydraulic engineering, extremely interested in the aqueducts of Carthage. So I mentioned Muhammad ibn Abdurrabbi. He and perhaps some other authors wrote a book called the Kitab al-Istibsar, and he talks at great length about Roman ruins at Constantine, at Carthage, many other places. So he's got a very keen awareness of that past in North Africa. So it is there, and it is important, but not to the same degree in the areas I was focused on, the Western Maghreb, partly because a lot of that area was not built up during the Roman period. I briefly mentioned Volubilis. So along the northern coastal strip and down to Volubilis, you have Roman remains, but then further south, it was beyond the Roman Empire. So foundations there like Marrakesh are completely outside the Roman sphere of influence. In terms of indigenous ideas, I think perhaps you can see them to a certain degree in how the Almoravids found Marrakesh and the fact that it is a bit atypical and they want parading space. They have quite a simple settlement. They have one fortress, which seems to echo building in other places like Azugi, or there's some fortresses mentioned in the oases where they used to gather. So you have this sort of sense of a small place where you might have one fortress, some simple building, but a sense of a town that expands and contracts as tribesmen come in and out, where you might have a tented city for part of the year or for at a particular moment, which then dissipates, just leaving the fortress, the grain store. And in fact, one interesting thing about North Africa is how many towns in their names contain Amazigh terms for granaries or storehouses. Think of Tagrort, which is in the Almoravid section of Tilimsan in western Algeria. The term means a granary. Agadir means a granary. So there's lots of references to notions of storing, which has a deep history in the Maghreb.
Okay, yeah, I would finish with
export their experience in North Africa to Granada, and that's the explanation of why Granada is the only founded city in the 11th century in Al-Andalus, or there's another ideas?
I'm so pleased you asked that question, because in my book I do just like throw down the gauntlet and suggest that that the Ta'ifa kingdoms are actually something that you see across the Strait of Gibraltar, and you can actually bring in some of the Zenata or Zirid principalities of North Africa and meaningfully compare them to Taifa kingdoms in the peninsula. And as you say, it is noteworthy that the migration from Elvira to Granada takes place under Zirid leadership, a migrant from North Africa who has actually been, he probably would have seen the foundation of Ashir. He would have had that example, would have been aware of Fatimid building at Msila, other places in North Africa. So obviously Granada is not, he doesn't proclaim Shiism, I'm not saying that Granada has any kind of sectarian linked Shiism, but just the idea of building the city, I'd certainly say was part of the Zirid imagination of being a ruler.
Bueno,